Cannabis landraces from the Congo Basin represent one of the most distinct ecological adaptations within the global lineage of the plant. The Congo River Basin stretches across equatorial Africa, encompassing dense rainforests, savannas, and regions defined by heavy seasonal rains and consistently high humidity. Cannabis cultivated in this environment could not resemble the resin-heavy, short-season plants of the Himalayas or the broad-leafed Kush varieties of Central Asia. Instead, Congolese landraces developed in response to conditions where moisture, light, and heat shaped every stage of growth. The equatorial latitude of the Congo creates a 12/12ths photoperiod year-round, roughly 12 hours of light and 12 hours of darkness each day. Unlike in temperate regions, cannabis here does not experience long summer days followed by shortening autumns. The plant, therefore, adapted to flower independently of drastic seasonal light changes, producing long flowering phenotypes that can extend 16 to 20 weeks before maturity. This trait, common among African landraces, is especially pronounced in the Congo, where plants must pace their life cycles against an environment that never offers the sharp seasonal cues familiar to growers in Europe or North America. High humidity and frequent rainfall imposed another selective pressure: mold resistance. Dense floral clusters would not survive prolonged exposure to equatorial moisture without rotting. Congolese cultivars evolved airy bud structures, with open calyx spacing that allows air circulation around flowers. To modern consumers accustomed to dense hybrid flowers, these structures might appear underdeveloped, but in their ecological context, they are precise adaptations for survival. Airy flowers, tall internodes, and elongated branching reduced the risk of fungal colonization, ensuring viable harvests even in persistently wet conditions. Morphologically, Congolese landraces are recognized for their tall stature and narrow leaves. Plants often exceed 3 meters in height, with fine serration and thin leaflets that minimize transpiration under intense equatorial sun. Their growth habit favors vertical stretch, allowing them to compete for light in environments where tall grasses and forest clearings create competition for canopy space. A notable phenotypic marker is the red pigmentation in stems, particularly pronounced in some regional varieties. While red stems are not unique to Congo, their consistent appearance in Congolese populations has become a defining aesthetic trait, linked to both anthocyanin expression and localized selection preferences among cultivators. Soil conditions in the Congo Basin further shaped these cultivars. The region's soils are often iron-rich, acidic, and nutrient variable, with fertility concentrated in areas influenced by river silt deposits. Cannabis grown in these conditions required resilience, adapting to inconsistent nutrient availability and periodic leaching from heavy rainfall. Farmers historically did not amend soils with synthetic fertilizers. Instead, selection favored plants capable of thriving in marginal and shifting conditions. Over time, this reinforced the durability of Congolese landraces as hardy, self-reliant cultivars, able to sustain growth under pressures that would collapse modern hybrid lines dependent on intensive inputs. Taken together, these factors define Congolese cannabis as a true equatorial land race, long-flowering, mold-resistant, tall, and airy, with red-stemmed phenotypes standing as visual markers of lineage. These traits are not ornamental. They are the record of environmental negotiation between cannabis and one of the most demanding agricultural landscapes on Earth. In Congo, cannabis was never forced into conformity with external strain categories. It became what it needed to be to endure equatorial heat, rainfall, and constant competition for light, emerging as a lineage that carries ecological precision unmatched in hybrid cultivars, bred for commercial uniformity. The cultural role of cannabis in the Congo Basin cannot be reduced to a single practice. It reflects the diversity of societies across Central Africa, each of which integrated the plant into existing systems of meaning. Unlike in Nepal, where cannabis resin was formalized into charas and explicitly tied to Hindu devotion, Congolese landraces circulated within a broader spectrum of social, medicinal, and ritual contexts. Their use was not marginal or ornamental, but embedded in daily life and cultural rhythm, adapted to the social structures of the communities that cultivated them. Cannabis in Congo carried strong associations with communal identity and performance. The plant's psychoactive effects were valued not only for relaxation, but for their capacity to stimulate conversation, endurance, and music making. Oral histories and ethnographic accounts note its role in ceremonies and gatherings where cannabis enhanced social cohesion. In this setting, the plant was not framed as an escape from labor or hardship, but as a complement to collective activity, sharpening focus, extending stamina, and amplifying the shared experience of song and dance. This electric quality, often attributed to Congolese cultivars by later Western observers, was understood locally as an energy that bound participants together. In ritual practice, cannabis functioned as a bridge material, a plant consumed to access altered states of awareness that facilitated divination, healing, or communication with the spiritual world. Healers and ritual leaders in parts of Central Africa employed cannabis as part of ceremonial preparation, where intoxication was not viewed as impairment, but as alignment with the spiritual forces guiding the ritual. Smoke was drawn communally, reinforcing both the authority of the ritual leader and the shared vulnerability of participants entering an altered state together. The plant's role in these ceremonies positioned it not as a profane substance, but as a medium of spiritual connection, tied to continuity between the material and immaterial. Medicinally, cannabis was employed in forms distinct from the recreational smoking familiar today. Infusions, poultices, and smoke inhalation were used for treatment of pain, digestive issues, and fatigue. In agrarian contexts, cannabis also functioned as a work aid. Farmers and laborers consumed it to sustain energy through physically demanding tasks, especially in conditions of heat and humidity. This utilitarian role was not trivial, but central to how cannabis was understood, a plant that gave strength and resilience, reinforcing its value in societies dependent on endurance and collective labor. The cultural framework of cannabis in Congo is further revealed in how it was named, described, and preserved. Local naming systems often emphasized observable traits, the red stem, the vigor of the plant, or the distinct psychoactive effects, rather than abstract categories. These descriptors served as cultural shorthand, enabling communities to identify and maintain lineages that were suited to their needs. In doing so, cultural practice reinforced genetic preservation. Plants that delivered valued effects or ritual reliability were prioritized for seed saving and replanting. Anthropologically, the Congolese case demonstrates that cannabis was never a neutral crop. It existed at the intersection of agriculture, ritual, and social life, carrying functions that extended far beyond intoxication. Its consumption was structured and purposeful, embedded in cultural systems that gave it legitimacy and meaning. By situating cannabis within this context, the Congolese landraces emerged not as raw material for later hybridization, but as cultivars that were actively curated through cultural selection, valued for traits that aligned with both spiritual and practical life. The economic role of cannabis in the Congo Basin extended well beyond subsistence use. While cultivation often began as a household practice tied to ritual and labor, surplus production created opportunities for exchange. Farmers who produced more than their community required could trade cannabis directly for food, tools, or livestock, integrating it into a barter economy that relied on reciprocal exchange rather than formal currency. In rural settings where access to coinage or cash was limited, cannabis resin and flower functioned as a parallel medium of value, a commodity both durable and consistently desired. Within local markets, cannabis held a dual identity. It was a social good, facilitating cohesion when consumed communally, and it was a tradable good, exchanged for material needs. This duality gave it resilience. Even in times when agricultural yields of staple crops faltered, cannabis maintained demand because of its role in both ritual and recreation. Its value did not depend solely on caloric contribution, but on the social and psychoactive benefits it delivered, making it a reliable trade item even under conditions of scarcity. Regional trade routes expanded the circulation of cannabis further. The Congo Basin sits at a crossroads of Central African networks, where rivers and overland paths facilitated movement between villages and towns. Traders moved cannabis alongside salt, iron goods, and agricultural produce, embedding it into the broader flow of exchange that sustained regional economies. Its portability was an advantage. Dried flower and resin could be carried long distances without spoilage, making it more resilient than perishable crops. In this way, cannabis became a connective commodity, linking geographically dispersed communities through the shared value placed on its effects. The arrival of outsiders intensified these dynamics. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, European colonial expansion into Central Africa altered trade patterns dramatically. While colonial administrations often ignored cannabis in favor of more lucrative commodities such as rubber, ivory, or timber, the plant's circulation persisted in informal markets. In some cases, cannabis was exchanged with laborers in extractive industries, serving as both incentive and relief in grueling working conditions. This integration into labor economies reinforced its economic weight, even as colonial authorities vacillated between tolerance and sporadic suppression. At the social level, cannabis exchange reinforced networks of trust and alliance. Because its consumption was often communal, its trade carried an element of reputation. A farmer known for producing reliable, potent cannabis gained social capital as well as economic benefit. In this sense, cannabis was not a neutral good, but a marker of credibility within communities. Its exchange reinforced bonds between families and villages, situating cannabis as both a crop and a social currency. Over time, Congolese landraces became known outside Central Africa for their distinctive psychoactive profile, a stimulating electric effect that contrasted with sedative cultivars from Asia. This reputation shaped their value not only locally, but in broader narratives of cannabis exchange, eventually influencing early European breeding projects. The perception of Congo cannabis as energizing and unique elevated its status in global terms, even though its trade remained informal and largely outside state-regulated systems. The economic and social exchange of Congolese landraces thus reveals a plant that was never confined to ritual or subsistence. It was a commodity that moved across networks, reinforced trust, and held value precisely because of the cultural meanings attached to it. Its persistence in trade, despite shifts in political and economic regimes, underscores the adaptability of both the plant and the societies that integrated it into their systems of exchange. The history of cannabis regulation in Congo reflects the broader collision between local cultural practices and external systems of governance. Before European colonization, cannabis was cultivated and traded openly, integrated into ritual, labor, and economic networks without restriction. Its role was accepted, normalized, and sustained through customary systems rather than legal codes. With the arrival of European colonial powers in the late 19th century, this equilibrium was disrupted. Colonial administrations, particularly under Belgian rule, imposed new categories of legality that redefined cannabis not as a cultural good, but as a substance subject to control. In the Belgian Congo, cannabis was largely invisible to administrators compared to resources like rubber, copper, and ivory. However, as European officials became aware of its widespread use among laborers, especially in mining and plantation economies, attitudes hardened. Colonial reports often framed cannabis as a threat to discipline and productivity, describing its stimulating effects as destabilizing to the labor order. By the early 20th century, colonial authorities began implementing restrictions, prohibiting open sale and penalizing cultivation outside subsistence contexts. These measures were not rooted in cultural understanding, but in a desire to regulate labor and maintain control over colonial subjects. The internationalization of prohibition came later. The 1925 Geneva Convention on Opium and Other Drugs included cannabis in its framework, pushing colonial administrations to align with emerging global norms. Belgium, as a signatory, extended this framework into its colonial territories, formalizing prohibitions on cannabis cultivation and trade in the Congo. What had once been normalized as part of daily and ritual life was legally recast as illicit. Enforcement, however, remained uneven. In rural regions where oversight was weak, cannabis cultivation persisted largely unchanged, while in urban centers and mining camps, enforcement was harsher, driven by colonial anxieties about labor control. Following independence in 1960, the newly established Congolese state inherited a legal framework rooted in colonial prohibition. Cannabis remained criminalized, and subsequent governments reinforced these restrictions under the influence of international treaties, such as the 1961 UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. As with Nepal, external pressure, particularly from Western states, compelled Congo to maintain prohibitionist policies in exchange for international legitimacy and aid. The plant that had been part of cultural continuity for centuries was further marginalized under a global system that treated it as a dangerous narcotic rather than a resource. The consequences of this legal framing were significant. Farmers who had once traded cannabis openly were forced into informal and clandestine networks. Ritual use continued, but under the risk of criminal penalty. Enforcement was selective, often reflecting broader patterns of corruption and political instability, but the underlying message was consistent. Cannabis was no longer a socially legitimate crop in the eyes of the state. This disjuncture between law and lived practice created a dual reality, one in which cannabis remained deeply rooted in culture and economy, while simultaneously existing under a cloud of criminalization. In the modern era, prohibition persists in Congo, even as global cannabis markets shift toward legalization. International discourse often celebrates the legacy of Congolese genetics, praising their unique psychoactive effects and contributions to global breeding, yet within Congo itself, cultivation remains penalized. This asymmetry highlights the central irony of cannabis regulation in post-colonial states. Land races that carry global prestige are suppressed locally, their farmers criminalized, and their cultural legitimacy undermined. The political and regulatory history of Congolese cannabis demonstrates how prohibition was not an organic development, but an external imposition, born from colonial control and sustained through international treaties. Its endurance reflects the structural power of global prohibitionist systems, which reshaped local practices without eliminating them, leaving cannabis suspended between cultural continuity and legal suppression. The criminalization of cannabis in Congo did not mark its disappearance. It marked the beginning of a long period of adaptation. What had once been cultivated openly in fields and traded in village markets was forced into a less visible but equally enduring cycle of production. Farmers who depended on cannabis as a supplementary crop and households that maintained it for ritual or medicinal purposes adjusted their methods rather than abandoning the plant. The underground persistence of Congolese landraces is evidence of the deep integration of cannabis into both cultural and agricultural life, surviving despite continuous legal pressure. In rural regions, adaptation took the form of strategic concealment. Farmers began planting cannabis within mixed cropping systems, interspersing it among maize, cassava, and sorghum. This tactic allowed cannabis to blend into the agricultural landscape, reducing the risk of detection by authorities. Remote fields and forest margins also became common cultivation sites, chosen for their distance from surveillance and for the natural cover provided by tall vegetation. These practices preserved seed continuity while reshaping cultivation into a more fragmented and hidden form. Seed saving remained central to survival. Families that had maintained Congolese landraces for generations continued the practice quietly, selecting seed from plants that displayed resilience and desired psychoactive traits. Unlike in industrialized contexts where prohibition spurred the importation of foreign genetics, Congolese farmers preserved local lines, ensuring that the land races retained their equatorial traits, long flowering, airy buds, and stimulating effects, even as their cultivation shifted underground. In this way, cultural memory and agricultural continuity became mechanisms of resistance to prohibition. Enforcement was inconsistent, shaped by geography and political instability. In urban centers and along transport corridors, authorities carried out more visible crackdowns, aligning with international expectations of compliance with prohibition treaties. Yet in rural villages, enforcement was often sporadic, influenced by corruption or the practical limits of state capacity. Farmers in some regions negotiated informal tolerance, where local officials turned a blind eye in exchange for bribes or in recognition of cannabis as a cultural staple. This uneven application of the law created pockets where cannabis continued to circulate with minimal interruption, even as it was condemned on paper. The underground persistence of cannabis also reinforced its role in trust-based networks. With open markets dismantled, exchange became more discreet, moving through relationships of kinship and community. Trust determined who could access cannabis and under what conditions, narrowing circulation but intensifying bonds among those involved. In some contexts, the very act of sharing cannabis under prohibition became a form of cultural resistance, affirming identity and continuity in the face of external suppression. Foreign demand, though less pronounced than in Nepal, played a role in sustaining underground cultivation. Travelers and traders who sought out the distinctive electric effects of Congolese landraces provided incentives for farmers to continue production, particularly in regions with access to cross-border routes. While this demand did not reshape cultivation on a mass scale, it reinforced the idea that Congolese cannabis carried value beyond local use, sustaining its reputation even under prohibition. The underground era did not erase Congolese landraces, it hardened them. The traits that had allowed them to survive equatorial climate now intersected with human strategies of secrecy and resilience. In this way, the persistence of cannabis in Congo mirrors the endurance of the communities themselves, adapting, negotiating, and continuing, despite the weight of colonial and post-colonial prohibitions. The plant survived not in defiance of culture, but because culture insisted on its continuity, ensuring that Congolese landraces remained a living archive of both ecological and social adaptation. In the modern cannabis landscape, Congolese landraces occupy a paradoxical position, globally celebrated yet locally marginalized. While prohibition persists within Congo itself, these cultivars are frequently invoked in international cannabis culture as iconic examples of African sativas, energetic, long-flowering, and genetically distinct. Their reputation has grown far beyond the villages and fields where they were originally cultivated, shaping breeding projects abroad and contributing to the symbolic geography of cannabis. Breeders in Europe and North America began seeking out Congolese genetics during the late 20th century, often through informal channels. Seeds were collected, sometimes directly from farmers, sometimes through intermediaries, and incorporated into hybridization programs. The goal was clear: to capture the stimulating electric psychoactive profile of Congolese landraces while reducing their impractically long flowering times. As a result, hybrids with Congolese lineage, often labeled red Congolese or similar names, entered global markets, offering consumers a domesticated version of the original equatorial effect. These projects cemented Congo's contribution to the global cannabis gene pool, even as the communities that maintained the original lines received little recognition or benefit. Symbolically, Congolese landraces became shorthand for vigor and intensity. In contrast to sedative Afghan or Kush cultivars, Congo was marketed in the West as a cultivar of clarity, focus, and stimulation. This symbolic identity reinforced global stereotypes about African sativas as distinct from their Asian or American counterparts, collapsing a wide range of African cannabis diversity into a single narrative of energy and brightness. While this image helped preserve interest in Congolese genetics, it also oversimplified their cultural and agronomic reality, reducing them to a marketing trope in the strain economy. The preservation of Congolese landraces remains contested. On one side, global seed banks and preservationists argue that these cultivars must be safeguarded as critical components of cannabis biodiversity. In an era where commercial hybrids dominate, the long-flowering, mold-resistant, and resilient traits of Congolese landraces represent genetic resources that may prove essential under changing climates. On the other side, the methods of preservation often raise concerns about bioprospecting and cultural appropriation. Seeds are collected, cataloged, and sold without formal mechanisms to recognize or compensate the communities that stewarded them for generations. This dynamic mirrors broader agricultural debates over the exploitation of indigenous cultivars by global markets. Meanwhile, within Congo, prohibition continues to suppress open cultivation, leaving farmers unable to capitalize on the global prestige of their genetics. The irony is stark. Cultivars that command attention in international breeding programs remain criminalized at their point of origin. For local farmers, the economic potential of Congolese cannabis is unrealized, locked behind laws that reflect international prohibitionist legacies rather than local cultural realities. The result is a situation where Congolese landraces survive in two forms, hidden in the fields of rural farmers and curated in foreign seed banks, each existing under very different systems of value and recognition. The global relevance of Congolese landraces today lies in this tension. They are both celebrated and endangered, preserved yet displaced. They demonstrate how cannabis, as a plant, transcends borders, but also how the politics of regulation and ownership shape who benefits from its survival. For the cannabis industry, Congolese landraces represent not only a set of desirable traits, but also a test case for how heritage genetics are acknowledged, protected, and integrated into the future of cannabis cultivation. Their legacy is not only agronomic, but ethical, demanding recognition that the communities who sustained them remain central to their story. The history of Congolese landraces demonstrates that cannabis cannot be confined to the language of Indica and Sativa. These cultivars are not abstractions, but the living result of equatorial conditions, cultural practices, and survival under political suppression. Their long flowering times, airy structures, and red-stemmed phenotypes are not quirks of strain type, but adaptations to the Congo Basin's climate and soil. Their psychoactive effects, remembered for their clarity and energy, were not accidental, but the product of cultural selection and communal use, carried forward through rituals, trade, and endurance. Placing Congolese cannabis within the beyond the Indica Sativa myth framework makes clear how much is lost when modern cannabis education collapses complexity into two categories. These land races remind us that cannabis evolved in relationship with people and places, not in laboratories, not in dispensary menus, but in agricultural and cultural systems that demanded resilience and meaning. To describe them only as sativa is to erase the history of how they were cultivated for endurance in humid climates, integrated into rituals of community and healing, and preserved under prohibition by farmers who refused to let them disappear. In today's global industry, Congolese landraces stand as both an inheritance and a warning. They are an inheritance because they expand the genetic library of cannabis, offering traits that modern hybrids cannot replicate without them. They are a warning because their survival is threatened not only by climate or prohibition, but by oversimplification, the reduction of their identity to a market trope. To move beyond the Indica Sativa myth is to acknowledge that cultivars like Congo must be understood in full as ecological adaptations, cultural artifacts, economic commodities, and global symbols all at once. This video is produced for educational and cultural purposes only. It is not intended as medical advice, nor does it promote or encourage the violation of local laws. Always comply with the cannabis regulations in your jurisdiction before cultivating, consuming, or transporting cannabis. If this deep dive into Congolese landraces gave you a clearer view of cannabis history, support the channel by liking the video, sharing your thoughts in the comments, and subscribing for more. Each action helps preserve these stories and amplifies education that goes beyond surface-level myths. Together, we can keep heritage cannabis in focus, not just as products, but as living history that deserves recognition and respect.